It all started as a way to clear my head, you know? I had just gone through one of those life-shattering breakups. You know, the kind where you find out the person you thought was going to be your future was betraying you with someone you trusted. Yeah, it was bad. So, what do you do when your world feels like it's crumbling? For me, I hit the road. I packed up my car and decided to take this long, cross-country trip to get as far away as possible from everything that reminded me of them. Utah was a spot I'd been excited about for a while. It's kind of a dream for hikers, and after everything, I needed to be alone in nature. No distractions, no people, just me and the wilderness. I found this secluded area in the Wasatch National Forest, a place that wasn't even on the regular trail maps. That was exactly what I was looking for. Somewhere far off the beaten path, with no other hikers around to disrupt the silence I was craving. So, I drove as far as I could down this narrow, dirt road. One of those where your car just barely fits between the trees. Finally, I reached this small, isolated spot, and I knew this was it. I stepped out of my car and just took in the surroundings. Total silence, nothing but trees and mountains all around. Felt like the perfect escape. I geared up, threw on my backpack, and checked my phone. No service, just the way I wanted it. I made a mental note of where I was parked and started my hike. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Hiking alone in the middle of nowhere, no cell service? It's risky, I get it. But honestly, I've always loved the freedom of solo hiking. No designated routes to follow, no one to worry about but myself. Just me, the trail, and the mountains. I had this spot in mind, a lookout point up at the summit. It was supposed to be about 3 or 4 miles away, not too far, but the terrain was tough. Rugged, rocky, uneven. The kind of hike that keeps you focused. About an hour in, it started to rain. Not heavy, just a light drizzle, but enough to be annoying. And if there's one thing I can't stand, it's hiking in the rain. So, I decided to call it and turn back early. I wasn't too far from my car at that point, so I figured no big deal. I'd just try again the next day. But as I came over the last ridge and spotted my car, my heart sank. All 4 tires slashed. Not just one flat, not just bad luck, all 4 tires deliberately cut. The reality hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this, deliberately, and I was completely alone, miles from the nearest road, with no cell service. That's when the fear started to creep in. I just stood there for a moment, staring at my car, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. My tires, all 4, were destroyed. Not just a puncture from a sharp rock or a stray nail. No, these were slashed, like someone had taken a knife and deliberately made sure I wasn't going anywhere. My first instinct was to look around. I whipped my head in every direction, scanning the tree line, the shadows, trying to catch any sign of movement. But all I saw were the dense trees stretching endlessly into the forest. The rain was still coming down in a light, steady patter, making it harder to hear anything other than my own breathing, which was getting faster. I tried to listen, really listen, hoping to catch something. A footstep, a branch snapping, even just the rustle of leaves. But the only thing I could hear was the rain and my own pulse pounding in my ears. Fear started to set in, the kind that gnaws at you slowly, creeping in until it's all you can feel. I wasn't just dealing with bad luck anymore. Someone had been here while I was out hiking. Someone had watched me walk away and decided to make sure I couldn't leave. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down and think rationally. I didn't have any cell service, not out here in the middle of nowhere. That meant I couldn't call for help, at least not from where I was. The nearest road, as far as I remembered, was over 20 miles away. Walking all that way, out in the open, didn't seem like the smartest move, especially if whoever slashed my tires was still nearby. I needed to find higher ground, somewhere I could get a signal, make a call, and get help, and fast. Then it hit me, the lookout point, the summit I had been trying to reach. It was the highest spot around, and I was pretty sure there'd be service up there. Without a second thought, I turned back toward the trail, back into the forest. My heart was racing, but I tried to keep myself steady. I needed to stay focused, keep moving. The rain wasn't letting up, and the sun was starting to dip lower, casting longer, darker shadows between the trees. I pushed forward, trying not to think about the fact that someone might be out there watching me. But about halfway up the trail, I heard it. A faint rustling sound, coming from behind me, maybe 40 or 50 yards back. I froze, my ears straining to catch more, but the sound stopped as soon as I did. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, didn't want to turn around and see what or who might be back there. Instead, I picked up the pace, walking faster, my boots slipping slightly on the wet ground. But every time I moved, the sound started up again, rustling, shuffling, as if someone was trying to match my steps, staying just out of sight. I knew I was a fast hiker, faster than most, but the thought that someone or something was following me, step for step, sent a surge of panic through me. The rain was falling harder now, the light fading quicker than I wanted it to. I needed to get to that summit. I pushed myself harder, heart pounding, feet slipping a little on the wet rocks as I climbed. The rustling behind me had stopped again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching, waiting for the right moment. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to be as discreet as possible. But all I saw were trees, shadows, and rain-soaked branches. No sign of anyone or anything. Still, the fear gnawed at me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just my imagination? Maybe it was just an animal, spooked by my presence. But deep down, I knew better. No animal slashes tires. No animal follows someone this quietly, this deliberately. The sun was almost gone now, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The rain had picked up, soaking through my clothes and making everything slick and treacherous. I could feel the tension building, every step feeling heavier, like I was dragging a weight behind me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself stop. The summit wasn't far, and I had to get there. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably just minutes, I reached the peak. The view would have been breathtaking under different circumstances, but I didn't even take a second to admire it. My eyes went straight to my phone, fumbling with it in my damp hands. I held my breath as the screen lit up. Service. Just enough to make a call. I didn't waste a second. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I pressed the buttons. The call connected, and I immediately gave them my location, told them about my car, about the tires, and most importantly, about the feeling I was being stalked. The operator stayed calm, but I could hear the concern in their voice. They said they'd send help, and, thank God, that my roadside assistance, AAA, could be called to help with the tires. But as relieved as I was to have someone know where I was, I knew my problems weren't over yet. I still had to get back through the forest, in the dark, with whatever was out there. I hung up, the tension in my body still coiled tight. Every instinct was screaming at me to stay on the summit, where I had a clear view of everything around me. But I couldn't stay. Night was falling fast, and I needed to be back at my car when help arrived. I looked around, considering my options. I couldn't just take the same path straight back down. That would be asking to walk right into whatever had been following me. No, I had to be smarter. I decided to take a wider route, walking parallel to the cliff for a while before cutting back into the forest at a different angle. I figured that if someone or something had set a trap, I might be able to avoid it this way. For a while, things were quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Every branch creaking, every rustle of leaves, every drop of rain. I was moving quickly but carefully, doing my best to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. My phone's GPS still worked, so I kept checking it, hoping I wasn't too far off course. But then, just as I started to feel a sliver of hope, I heard it again. This time it was a snap, a twig breaking underfoot, not from behind me but from the left, deeper in the woods. I turned, heart in my throat, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But once again, there was nothing, just darkness and shadows. I pressed on, trying to stay calm, but it didn't take long before I heard another sound. This time from directly behind me. It was closer now and unmistakable. There wasn't just one person out there. There were multiple. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just being followed by one person. There was a group and they were closing in. Panic surged through me, and I picked up the pace, breaking into a light jog. My feet slipped on the wet ground, but I didn't care. I had to move. Faster. I was practically running now, the rain stinging my face, my heart thundering in my chest. The sound of footsteps, those deliberate, eerie footsteps, was getting louder, more frequent. It was clear they weren't hiding anymore. Whoever was out there, they knew I knew, and they didn't care. I kept pushing forward, trying to stay calm, but the fear was clawing at me, telling me to run. Every few seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see them, whoever they were, but the shadows seemed to be playing tricks on me, twisting and shifting with every turn of my head. And then, as if the night couldn't get worse, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. A small, makeshift campsite, tucked away in the woods. The sight of it stopped me dead in my tracks. There was a fire pit, surrounded by logs arranged in a circle, clearly meant for sitting. The fire was out, but it hadn't been out for long. The ash was still damp from the rain, but the layout, the careful arrangement of the space, it all screamed one thing. Someone had been here recently, maybe just a few hours ago. My mind raced. This wasn't some random encounter. Whoever had slashed my tires, whoever had been following me, they were part of this. I was in their territory. This was no accident. I quickly skirted around the campsite, trying to keep my distance, but the unease was overwhelming now. I wasn't just being hunted. I was walking straight into the heart of something organized. Something far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. I picked up the pace again, moving as quickly as I could without outright sprinting, casting nervous glances behind me every few seconds. The rain was still coming down in a steady drizzle, and the light was almost completely gone now, leaving me in near darkness. My only guide was the dim glow of my phone's GPS. And then I heard it, another snap. This time it was close. Too close. I spun around, just in time to see it. A foot, disappearing behind a tree. Someone had been following me, barely 20 yards back, trying to keep hidden. That was it for me. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I didn't care about planning my route or avoiding traps. I just ran, full-on sprinting through the trees, not caring how loud I was, not caring if they heard me. I could hear the rustling behind me getting louder, faster. They weren't hiding anymore. They were chasing me now, openly, recklessly. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. Every instinct in my body was screaming to keep going, to run for my life. I shot another glance over my shoulder and saw them, at least 6 of them, all dressed in white, moving fast, weaving between the trees like they knew this forest better than I ever could. They were gaining on me. Panic surged through my veins. My car wasn't far. If I could just make it there. I forced my legs to move faster, the sounds of their pursuit growing louder, closer. The world around me blurred, my vision narrowing to the path ahead, the only thing that mattered. And then, finally, I saw it, my car, and just beyond it, the flashing lights of a police car. I nearly collapsed from relief. I stumbled toward the police car, legs shaking, lungs burning, feeling like I was about to collapse. I could barely catch my breath. The relief of seeing those flashing lights was so overwhelming that I almost forgot about the danger still behind me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop until I reached the car. The officer stepped out, and before he could say anything, I gasped. They're chasing me. I turned around, fully expecting to see those 6 figures in white charging down the path after me. But when I looked, there was nothing. The forest was still. The only sound was the soft patter of rain on the leaves, the night eerily calm again, like it had swallowed the chaos whole. I stood there, panting, staring into the trees, trying to make sense of it. I had seen them, I knew they were there. The officer must have seen the panic in my eyes because he didn't question me. He didn't tell me I was imagining things or that I was just paranoid. Instead, he calmly guided me to the side of his cruiser, asking me to sit and catch my breath. He assured me that he'd already called AAA to come and deal with my tires and that they'd be there shortly. But my mind was racing. Couldn't let it go. They were there, I said, my voice trembling. 6 people all dressed in white. They were chasing me. Just a second ago, the officer's expression shifted, just slightly, and I could tell he was thinking about what to say. He nodded slowly, then said, "You're not the first person to report strange things around these parts." That statement hit me hard. I wasn't the first. My heart pounded as he continued. Utah has a lot of wilderness, places people don't usually go. Some of those places have history, a history that not everyone knows about. Cults, religious groups, people who live off the grid. This forest, specifically, has a reputation for strange encounters. I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Cults? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The officer nodded. Woods folk, they're sometimes called. Groups that don't like outsiders. They tend to stick to themselves, but if someone crosses into their territory, well, let's just say they don't always handle it well. I felt a chill run down my spine. It all started to make sense. The slashed tires, the campsite hidden deep in the woods, the people in white stalking me. I had crossed into their land, and they had wanted to send me a message. Why didn't they just tell me to leave? I asked, my voice shaking. Why go through all this? The officer shrugged, his expression grim. Could be they didn't want to talk. Could be they wanted to scare you, or worse. He paused, his eyes scanning the treeline. Whatever the case, you were smart to run. You're lucky you made it out. I sat there, the rain now just a gentle mist, still too shaken to fully process everything. The flashing lights from the cruiser reflected off the wet ground, casting eerie shadows into the trees. Part of me expected to see one of those white-clad figures emerge from the woods, watching me, waiting. But they didn't. They were gone. Or maybe they were just hiding, waiting for the next person to stumble into their territory. When the AAA truck finally arrived to replace my tires, I couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. The trees were dark and silent, but I knew better now. There was something in there, something I'd never forget. As I drove away, leaving those woods behind, I couldn't stop thinking about the cop's words. I had been lucky, but the truth was, not everyone who ventured into those woods made it out to tell their story. And even now, I still wonder, what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived in time? I've always been a sucker for exploring places that most people avoid, especially the kind that have creepy stories attached to them. You know, those places that are off-limits, abandoned, or just shrouded in mystery. Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut was one of those places. I'd read a little about it beforehand, just enough to know the basics. The entire town was abandoned in the 1800s, and ever since, there have been all sorts of rumors about why. People disappearing, strange sounds, even whispers of curses. But I'm not superstitious. I never have been. To me, it was just another forest, another spot on the map waiting to be explored. The fact that it was technically off-limits didn't bother me either. I've crossed into places I wasn't supposed to be plenty of times. So, one afternoon, I packed up my gear and decided to take a trip. Dudleytown was only a few hours' drive, and I figured, why not? It's not every day you get the chance to explore a place like that. I pulled up to the edge of the woods around noon. The sun was high, and I thought I'd have plenty of time to get in, take a look around, and head back before dark. No big deal, right? I stepped out of the car, glanced around, and started walking into the trees. Almost immediately, I noticed how quiet it was. I'm used to the usual sounds of a forest, the rustling of leaves, birds calling, maybe the distant scurrying of animals. But there was none of that here. It was unnerving. I shrugged it off at first, chalking it up to the time of day or just a quiet patch of woods, but still it felt strange. The further I walked, the more that silence pressed down on me. It wasn't like any forest I'd ever been in. The air felt thick, heavy, like even the trees were watching me. But I kept going. This was what I signed up for after all, an adventure, a break from the normal trails. I had my pack of homemade trail marking stickers, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I kept slapping them onto trees as I went, taking note of my path so I could get back easily. About half an hour in, I realized I hadn't seen or heard a single sign of life. No animals, no birds, nothing. It was just me, the trees, and that deafening silence. And yet, I didn't feel alone. That's the weird part. I felt like something was off, like the forest itself was waiting for something. I shook off the feeling, focusing on the exploration. I had come all this way, so I wasn't going to let a few creepy vibes stop me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease that was settling in. I kept moving, telling myself it was just nerves. The stories, the legends, they were probably getting into my head. But in the back of my mind, I knew something wasn't right. That silence, it wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. I kept moving, trying to shake off that feeling, but it wasn't going away. The deeper I went into the forest, the more unsettling it became. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, almost like a distant moan carried on the wind. It made me stop dead in my tracks, listening hard, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind, but there wasn't any. The air was still, oppressively still. The sound was low and drawn out, almost like a wounded animal, but it wasn't quite right. It was more like a wail. That's the best way I can describe it. A long, eerie wail echoing through the trees. My first instinct was to turn around, to head back the way I came, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood there, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Somewhere deeper in the woods, just out of sight. The wailing continued, rising and falling in this eerie rhythm. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I had been in quiet forests before, sure, but I had never heard anything like this. I debated with myself for a moment. Should I go toward the sound or get the hell out of there? Something about that noise tugged at my curiosity, even though every instinct was screaming at me to leave. Against my better judgment, I started moving toward it, slowly, carefully, trying to keep my footsteps as quiet as possible. The wail would start, then stop, then start again, always in that same drawn-out, unsettling tone. As I got closer, it seemed to shift, like it wasn't coming from one direction anymore, but from all around me. It was like the sound was bouncing off the trees, distorting, playing tricks on my ears. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, and that made my pulse quicken. I forced myself to stay calm, but I couldn't ignore the way my heart was racing now. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to get scared. Whatever was making that noise, it didn't sound like anything natural. I kept going, pushing further into the trees, and the wailing grew louder, more intense. But it was still the only sound in the entire forest. No birds, no wind, just that eerie, unnatural moan. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some animal. This wasn't something I could explain away. Something or someone was out here with me. The unease I had felt earlier wasn't just nerves. I wasn't alone in this forest, and whatever was out there, I wasn't sure it wanted me to leave. My grip tightened on my backpack straps as I stood there, frozen in place, listening to that haunting sound fill the forest. I knew I should turn around. I knew I should head back to the car and get out of there. But for some reason, I couldn't make myself move. It was as if the forest itself was holding me there, keeping me in place, waiting for something to happen. And all I could do was stand there and listen to the wailing echoing through the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening to that wailing echo around me, trying to make sense of it. My heart was pounding, every instinct telling me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was stuck in place, hypnotized by the sound, the eeriness of it filling the air around me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the wailing stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just complete, suffocating silence. It was like the forest had swallowed the sound whole, leaving me standing there in the eerie stillness. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath. My nerves were on edge, and my mind was racing. What the hell was that? I thought to myself. It didn't feel like a wounded animal. No, this felt deliberate. And now, whatever was making that noise was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that made my skin crawl. I decided that was it. No more of this weirdness. I was turning back. I reached for the next trail marker I'd left on a tree and started retracing my steps. But as I walked, something else caught my eye. On one of the trees just ahead of me, there were carvings. My heart skipped a beat as I got closer, squinting through the dimming light. They weren't words or letters, just strange, jagged symbols carved deep into the bark. It was hard to make out exactly what they were supposed to be, but the marks were fresh. Whoever or whatever had made them had done so recently. I looked around, my eyes scanning the trees nearby. There were more carvings on at least half a dozen trees around me. All of them had these strange, cryptic symbols slashed into the wood. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't the work of random hikers or kids messing around. This felt intentional. Suddenly, I felt exposed, like I was standing in the middle of something I shouldn't be. That sense of being watched, the one that had been gnawing at me since I entered the forest, came back stronger than ever. I wasn't alone out here. Someone or something was leaving these marks, and I had just stumbled right into the middle of it. I didn't need any more convincing. My gut told me to turn around now. I grabbed my trail markers and started pulling them off the trees as I went, moving faster, my eyes darting around, looking for any movement. My legs felt tense, ready to break into a run at the slightest sign of anything off. But as I hurried through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one retracing my steps. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just the darkening forest and those strange, haunting symbols carved into the trees. The air felt thick again, heavy with the silence. I couldn't hear the wailing anymore, but the absence of sound felt just as bad, like something was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I kept walking, faster now, pulling the trail markers as I passed, trying to retrace my steps as quickly as I could. But the deeper I went, the more that feeling of dread settled in. Something or someone was following me. I just couldn't see them yet. I kept walking, my pace quickening with each step, my breath coming faster now. The feeling of being watched, being followed, it was unbearable. I knew something was out there, tracking me, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing but shadows and trees. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, in the distance, through the dense trees, there was a shape. It was dark and low to the ground, something that didn't belong. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a rock or a bush. It was a cave. A small, black opening nestled into the side of a rocky hill, just barely visible through the underbrush. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mind racing. That cave hadn't been there before. There was no way I would have missed it on my way in. But there it was now, like it had appeared out of nowhere. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, a sense of dread washing over me. And then, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My trail markers, they weren't where I had left them. I had been so focused on the carvings and that eerie feeling of being followed that I hadn't noticed it until now. The stickers I had placed on the trees, my guide back to the car, had been moved. They were too low on the trunks now, almost at waist height, when they should have been up at shoulder level. Someone or something had been messing with them, leading me right toward this cave. Panic surged through me. I had been walking in circles, following a path that wasn't mine. Someone had been deliberately leading me here, drawing me toward this spot. I took a step back, my body screaming to run, but the silence around me felt like it was pressing in from all sides. I turned to look behind me, scanning the trees, and that's when I heard it again. The wailing. But this time, it was different, louder, closer, and filled with an urgency that sent a jolt of terror through me. It was coming from the direction of the cave, echoing through the trees, surrounding me. My legs moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was running full speed, away from the cave and that awful bone-chilling sound. Branches whipped against my arms, the ground slick under my feet as I tore through the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The wailing didn't stop. It followed me, getting louder, as if it were chasing me. I could hear the sound of footsteps, Heavy, deliberate footsteps crashing through the underbrush, like whoever or whatever wasn't bothering to hide anymore. I didn't dare look back. Couldn't. All I could do was run, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but the thought of that thing behind me, of that cave and those symbols, pushed me forward. I was being hunted, and I didn't know why. I ran like my life depended on it, because at that moment I truly believed it did. The wailing was getting louder, closer, like it was right behind me, chasing me through the darkening forest. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to keep going, to not stop, to not look back. The forest seemed to blur around me as I sprinted through the trees, my legs burning, my lungs aching, but I didn't dare slow down. The sound of footsteps crashed through the underbrush behind me, and I knew without a doubt that whoever or whatever had led me here was still following. It wasn't hiding anymore, it was hunting. I glanced at my phone, praying for some sort of signal, but nothing. The screen flickered, and I could barely make out the faint glow of the map. I was so close to where I'd started, just a little farther, I told myself, but the wailing wouldn't stop. It seemed to be surrounding me now, echoing off the trees, coming from everywhere at once. I couldn't tell if it was one voice or many, but it was relentless. I pushed harder, my muscles screaming in protest, every step feeling heavier than the last. And then, as if by some miracle, I saw it just through the trees, the edge of the forest, the place where I had started. My car. I could barely believe it, but there it was, just a few yards ahead. I felt a surge of relief, almost too much to handle, but I didn't let myself slow down. Not yet. I sprinted the last stretch, nearly tripping over the roots and rocks, until I reached the clearing. My car was still there, right where I had left it, and I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling. I could still hear the wailing behind me, but it was fading now, like it had been cut off the moment I broke through the edge of the trees. I shoved the key into the lock, my fingers slipping in my panic, and finally, the door clicked open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat there for a moment, my heart racing, trying to catch my breath. The forest was silent again, just like before. No footsteps, no wailing, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. Not yet. I started the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel, and without looking back, I sped off down the road, leaving that cursed place behind me. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires was like a lifeline, pulling me farther and farther away from whatever had been chasing me. Even now, thinking back to it, I can't fully explain what happened out there. The wailing, the cave, the symbols on the trees. It all feels like a bad dream, but I know it was real. I've tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe it was some hermit, some lunatic living out there trying to mess with me. But deep down, I know that's not the whole story. There's something wrong with Dudleytown Forest. Something that doesn't want to be found. And whatever it is, I'll never go looking for it again. So, picture this. It was one of those lazy summer nights, and me and my friends, Chester, Rick, Jasper, and Hassan, were hanging out in my basement. My parents didn't care much about what we did down there. They gave us the space, and we had full access to my dad's man cave, which meant plenty of beer. We had the music going, just shooting pool, but, to be honest, we were starting to get bored. That's when Chester had one of his genius ideas. "Let's hike out to the reservoir," he said, like it was some brilliant revelation. I didn't need much convincing. The reservoir was basically my childhood hangout spot, you know? I used to sneak through a hole in the fence and head over there to escape, swim, smoke, or just clear my head. It was my personal sanctuary, even though it was illegal to go there. Not that I cared. So we all agreed. We grabbed some beers because why not? The sun was still out, and we figured we'd make it there before dark. 5 of us heading out into the woods, with that buzz of excitement and just a bit of stupidity. It had rained earlier, so the ground was muddy, but that didn't stop us. The woods behind my house were like a second home to me. I'd been through there a million times, so getting to the reservoir was a no-brainer. As we walked, the air was cool, and we could hear the distant hum of bugs starting their evening symphony. It was peaceful, but the further we went, the quieter it got. By the time we reached the fence, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. We slipped through the hole I'd cut years ago, and the reservoir stretched out in front of us, calm and quiet. It was huge, this wide expanse of water, surrounded by thick trees and cliffs. There was something about it that always made me feel like I was stepping into another world, cut off from everything else. We made our way along the edge, heading for our usual spot, a cliff on the near side where we liked to chill. We cracked open some beers, laughing, joking around, just enjoying the moment. It was one of those times when everything feels right, you know? Like nothing could go wrong. But then, Chester, who was a few steps ahead, stopped dead in his tracks and raised his hand. "Do you guys see that?" he asked, his voice low. We all froze, our eyes following where he was pointing. And that's when we saw it. Across the reservoir, on the far side, something or someone was moving. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible through the trees. We squinted, trying to make out what it was, but it didn't take long before we realized. It was a person. They were dragging something heavy, moving slowly toward the water. My stomach dropped as I strained to see what they were pulling. It was a black garbage bag, the kind of bag that's meant to hide whatever's inside. And it looked like whatever was in it was heavy. Too heavy. We all exchanged nervous glances, the laughter and casual mood from before vanishing in an instant. My heart started to race. There had been bodies found in this reservoir before, more than once. And now we were about to witness something we definitely weren't supposed to see. We stood there, frozen, watching as this figure dragged the garbage bag closer to the water. None of us said a word. Our group, which had been so loud and carefree just minutes earlier, was now dead silent, each of us glued to the sight across the reservoir. The closer the figure got to the water's edge, the clearer things became. The bag was big, bulky, and it dragged heavily along the ground. My mind was racing, trying to convince myself that this wasn't what I thought it was. Maybe it was just some trash or something harmless, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. You don't haul a bag like that to a secluded reservoir unless you're trying to get rid of something you don't want anyone to find. We could barely make out the person from that distance, but their movements were slow, deliberate, almost like they were in no hurry. After what felt like forever, they reached the water's edge, kneeling down next to the bag. We couldn't see exactly what they were doing, but whatever it wasn't good. Rick finally whispered, "What the hell are we looking at?" His voice was shaky, and I could hear the tension in it. No one answered. We were all too freaked out to even think straight. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Chester spotted something else. "There are more of them," he muttered under his breath. I turned to look, and sure enough, 3 more figures emerged from the woods on the far side. 2 of them were dragging bags, just like the first one. But the third was carrying a kayak over his head. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. This wasn't random. This wasn't some trash cleanup or late-night fishing trip. These people had a plan, and we were watching it unfold in real time. My throat went dry as we watched them gather near the water, their figures barely visible in the fading light. The first man had already started paddling the kayak out onto the reservoir, one of the garbage bags in his lap. We watched, horrified, as he reached the middle of the water and slowly slid the bag overboard. It disappeared under the surface with barely a ripple. He paddled back to shore, calm as ever, like this was something they did all the time. They loaded the second bag into the kayak, repeating the process. One by one, the bags disappeared beneath the water, vanishing into the depths of the reservoir. And all we could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, too scared to move or make a sound. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it from across the water. We should have left right then and there, but it was like we were trapped in some kind of terrible dream, unable to wake up or look away. That's when my phone rang. The shrill ringtone cut through the silence like a knife, echoing across the water and straight into the ears of the 4 men standing on the shore. Every one of them turned to look in our direction. I felt my blood run cold. In that split second, everything changed. The 4 men, who had been moving so deliberately, so methodically, froze and turned their heads toward us, their eyes locking on our spot across the reservoir. My phone's ringtone still echoed in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. I fumbled to silence it, my hands shaking, but it was too late. They had heard us. They had seen us. And now we were exposed. For a moment, none of us moved. It felt like time had slowed down, like the world had narrowed to just us and those men across the water. My friends were silent, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, without warning, Rick turned and bolted. He didn't say a word, just took off into the trees, his footsteps loud against the underbrush. That snapped the rest of us out of our paralysis, and suddenly we were all running, crashing through the woods in a desperate scramble to get away. Behind us, I heard one of the men shout something, but I didn't stop to listen. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was on getting as far away from that reservoir as possible. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, making my legs move faster than I thought they could. The branches whipped at my arms and face, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting distance between us and them. Rick was ahead of us, yelling something over his shoulder, but I could barely hear him over the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, fast footsteps crashing through the woods behind us. They were chasing us. "They're coming," Jasper shouted, his voice barely audible between gasps of breath. That was all I needed to hear. We were being hunted. Running in the dark forest was like a nightmare come to life. The mud from the earlier rain made every step treacherous, my boots slipping as I tried to keep up with Rick's frantic pace. Every few seconds, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of those men right behind me, closing in. We were heading back the way we came, toward the hole in the fence, but in the chaos, everything looked different. The shadows twisted and stretched, making it impossible to know how far we had gone or how close we were to getting out. The woods, which had once felt familiar and safe, now seemed hostile, like they were conspiring against us, trapping us. Hassan, who was usually the calmest of the group, was barely holding it together. "Where's the hole?" he shouted, panic in his voice. I could hear the fear in him, the same fear that was building inside me. We were close, but the fence was still out of sight, and with every passing second, I could feel those men getting closer. Just as I was about to give up hope, Rick pointed ahead, shouting, "There it is!" A small gap in the fence came into view, barely visible in the darkness. Relief surged through me. If we could just get through that fence, we'd be out of the woods and back in familiar territory. We'd be safe, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. But as we neared the fence, I heard it. The unmistakable snap of a branch not far behind us. They were close, too close. "Go, go, go!" I yelled, practically shoving Chester through the hole as I kept an eye on the trees behind us. The footsteps were right there, just out of sight. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of their presence bearing down on us. As I squeezed through the fence, I heard a loud crack, someone stepping on a tree branch just a few feet away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know how close they were. I just ran, my heart pounding, my lungs burning, desperate to get back to my house. We didn't stop until we hit my backyard. We burst into my backyard, gasping for breath, stumbling over each other as we ran. My legs felt like they were on fire, my chest heaving with each breath. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, but at least we were out of the woods, out of that nightmare, or so we thought. I glanced back toward the trees, half expecting to see those men emerging from the shadows, but the woods were still, silent. It was like we had left them behind, but the unease hadn't gone away. My whole body was trembling, and I could see the same fear reflected in my friend's eyes. No one said a word for a few moments. We were too busy trying to catch our breath, too shaken to process what had just happened. Hassan was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "What the hell was that?" He looked pale, his hands shaking as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. No one had an answer. What was that? Why were they dumping those bags? Who the hell were those people? I felt sick to my stomach, the reality of what we had just witnessed sinking in. The bags, the kayak, they weren't just getting rid of trash. They were disposing of something much worse. And the fact that they had chased us, it was enough to confirm every fear I had. Jasper fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. He quickly explained what had happened to the operator, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Yeah, we saw something. People dumping bags into the reservoir. They chased us. We're at my friend's house now." The operator assured us that they were sending a squad car right away. But even with the police on their way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. We might have made it back to the safety of my yard, but those guys knew the area better than we did. They could have easily followed us. Just as I was about to say something, I heard it. A soft, barely audible crunch. The unmistakable sound of someone stepping on a branch just beyond the fence. I froze. So did the others. We all turned toward the woods, eyes scanning the darkness, trying to see if anyone had followed us. And then, faintly, we saw it. A shadow moving between the trees. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body going cold with fear. They had followed us. "Get inside," I whispered, barely able to speak through the fear. I didn't have to say it twice. We all bolted for the back door, slamming it shut behind us and locking it. Inside the house, we huddled by the window, trying to peer through the blinds without being seen. The backyard was dark, the moon casting eerie shadows across the lawn. But the woods, they were alive with movement. We could see them now. At least one of the men, standing just at the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching the house. My stomach dropped. They knew where we lived. Jasper whispered, "What do we do?" But none of us had an answer. The police were on their way. But that didn't help the fact that these guys were right outside. We were trapped in our own house, waiting. Minutes felt like hours. The tension was suffocating. Every noise, every creak of the house, made us jump. I kept watching the tree line, expecting the man to make a move, but he just stood there, still as a statue. The others, were they hiding too? Were they out there waiting for us to make a mistake? Finally, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The flashing blue and red lights filled the yard, and 2 police cars pulled up to the house. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt a small flicker of hope. The cops rushed to the door and we quickly let them in. They listened as we told them everything, about the reservoir, the bags, the chase, and the men in the woods. I could see the officers exchanging uneasy glances as we spoke. They didn't doubt us, but they knew this was serious. One of the cops radioed for backup, while the other went out into the yard to search the perimeter. I watched as his flashlight beams scanned the woods, the light cutting through the darkness. Then he stopped, his flashlight fixed on something near the fence. He crouched down and motioned for us to come over. When we got closer, my heart nearly stopped. There, pressed into the mud, were footprints, fresh, deep, leading from the woods to my backyard. They hadn't just watched us. They'd been right there. My heart dropped when I saw those footprints. They were deep, fresh, leading straight up to the fence where we had just been standing minutes earlier. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Those men weren't just lurking in the woods. They had been here, right outside, watching us. Maybe even listening to us as we panicked inside the house. I looked at the officer, my throat dry. That's not ours, I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. The officer nodded grimly. "I didn't think so," he said. His expression was serious, his eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting the men to step out at any second. He motioned for his partner, and they both moved toward the woods, flashlights cutting through the darkness. I watched as they disappeared into the trees, their beams of light bouncing off the trunks and underbrush. We were left standing there, me and my friends, huddled together on the back porch, still trying to process everything that had happened. The thought that they had come that close, that they had been standing just feet away from us, made my skin crawl. A few minutes later, one of the officers returned, shaking his head. "They're gone. We didn't find anyone out there, but these footprints are fresh. They were watching you." My stomach twisted. I could still feel their presence, even though I couldn't see them. It was like the woods themselves were holding onto the memory of those men, their eerie silence still lingering. "What about the reservoir?" Chester asked, his voice shaky. He looked as pale as I felt. "You're gonna check it, right? Those bags. There were bodies, I'm sure of it." The officer nodded. "We've called for backup. We're going to search the area and the reservoir. You did the right thing calling us. This could have been much worse." That didn't exactly comfort me. The fact that we were standing here, alive and safe, didn't make the terror of the last hour disappear. Those men were out there somewhere, and they knew we had seen them. They knew we had called the cops. Over the next few days, I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, barely able to sleep. Every rustle outside my window, every creak in the house, made my heart race. I was sure they would come back, that they would want revenge for what we had seen. The police didn't find them that night, but what they did find made headlines all across town. 3 bodies, all wrapped in garbage bags just like we had seen. They pulled them from the reservoir, confirming everything we had feared. It was a huge news story for weeks. The police investigated, but as far as I know, they never caught the men responsible. No arrests, no leads. It was like those guys had vanished into thin air. My parents were terrified. They wanted to move, and I couldn't blame them. My mom swore she saw people standing in the woods at night, their shadows just barely visible through the trees. One night, she even claimed she saw a flash, like someone taking pictures. I didn't know if she was imagining it, or if they were really still out there watching us. A few months later, we did move. I haven't been back to the reservoir since, and honestly, I never want to. That place, that night, it changed everything for me. What was once my sanctuary had become something far darker. I couldn't even walk through the woods without feeling that same creeping fear, like something was lurking just out of sight. And the worst part? Those men. They're still out there, somewhere. I still wonder what would have happened if my phone hadn't rung that night. Would they have come for us? Would we have ended up in those bags, sinking into the depths of the reservoir? I guess I'll never know, but I'll never forget it.